Now, from the left coast, another in-depth interview from Peter B. Collins. Peter B's been talking about news and politics since Watergate and generously shares his knowledge, wisdom, opinions, and outrage here because his friends and family can't take it anymore. Peter B's an independent progressive who upsets Democrats and Republicans as conditions require and is one of the few lefty pundits who predicted Trump would win. This podcast is funded entirely by listeners like you, and subscribers get first access to these in-depth interviews. When you're ready, go to peterbcollins.com/sign up. Now, here's your humble host, Peter B. Collins.
Here's another episode in the last interview series here as Peter B. Collins gets ready to retire. Bringing back some of my favorite guests from over the years. Today, Joe Lauria and Ray McGovern. Information warriors.
Give us 20 minutes and we'll give you the world. We bring good things to life. The news you need from people you can count on. Doing what we do best. The heartbeat of America. Heartbeat of America. Your true voice. You're in good hands.
Jackson Brown opens the podcast today with Information Wars. Joe Lauria is the editor-in-chief at consortiumnews.com. He took over when Robert Perry, the founder, died a few years back. And Consortium News has long featured the work of Ray McGovern, the CIA analyst who blew the whistle. I first met Ray after one of the great Robert Greenwald documentaries that exposed the rush to war in Iraq. That would have been about 2004. Joe and Ray, thanks for joining me today.
Glad to be with you.
Happy to be here, Peter.
So, first, I just want to say that Consortium News has been a real influence on my work since I first connected with Robert Perry, and I've been going back through my archives and records, and I think my first conversation with Bob was around 2005 or 2006. And his search for, evidence-based news coverage is something that still is a standard that, Joe, you have maintained. And it's really sad to see how the rest of the media has really descended into various forms of yellow journalism in the meantime. And, Joe, let me start with you. You worked for many years as a newspaper correspondent. Your focus was on the United Nations, and your freelance work showed up in many places across the United States, Canada, and the English-speaking world. And I just want to tell you, you have done a great job since Bob passed away, and I think you've maintained the integrity of the site and the real desire to report news and not just spin and political talking points.
Well, I don't know how much I could thank you for that, Peter, because it's obviously was almost an impossible job. Yeah, the major principle of Bob's that we've tried to maintain is nonpartisanship. And that was an important thing even going back, and I've been reading Bob's old stories, back 10 years ago, around the Obama time. He was already talking about how partisanship was taking over journalism. And his very last article, and Ray has often referred to this because it was an incredible piece that he wrote just a few weeks before he died, was really his parting shot at the state of corporate media or mainstream media. And again, the lack of objectivity, or no, not objectivity, I want to say impartiality, which is different.
Yes. Not
taking one side or the other, which is journalism 101, had already completely disappeared in his view. But if he'd been around to see what's gone on the last couple of years and this election, I mean, it's only gotten even worse if it's possible. And we've stood out there to not take either side in this election and to criticize both sides. I think that's just fundamental journalism. And for that, of course, we're attacked mercilessly by both sides. And we're expected supposedly to follow the Democrats. And I think Bob in his earlier days may have been more sympathetic to the Democrats. And he's always pinned the Republicans for starting this deterioration of media, going back to Rush Limbaugh and the conservatives' control of talk radio and, of course, Fox. But he, in his last piece that I just referred to, he made it very clear that the Democratic media had just copied now what the Republicans had done, and that there was very little hope for journalism. And I'm trying to keep that hope alive, and our writers and our team at Consortium News.
And Bob passed away in early 2017, but he was already onto the scam of Russiagate, and he was very careful in how he evaluated the leak-driven, anonymous source-driven narrative. And, that was then extended not only at Consortium News, but I see it as a center of this work. And, Ray, your organization, the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, made major contributions. And Bill Binney, who I knew separately from VIPS and had been talking with for many years, but his technical knowledge really helped inform my own skepticism of the fundamental claim that Russia hacked the DNC servers. And I just want to acknowledge, Ray, that you have written many columns about these issues. You haven't stopped even in recent weeks. And this is one of the biggest errors of the corporate media in my lifetime.
Well, I can only agree, Peter B. It's huge. And just connecting that with what Joe said. I'm sorry, let me just get rid of that. Sorry. Just connecting that with what Joe said about Bob's last piece. That was on New Year's Eve. And he was just recovering from his first stroke. Mm-hmm. He told me that he had real problems just seeing, much less reading. And he composed this this very, very poignant piece about how he and Cy Hirsch and the others just couldn't get any traction in the main media. That was at the end of December. Now, on the 13th of December, 2000 and what we're talking 16, I guess, 16. Mm-hmm. After Trump was elected, all this stuff started coming out, including the overheard or the conversations between Peter Strzok, the deputy head of counterintelligence in the FBI, and his lover, Lisa Page, who was a top lawyer for the deputy director, McCabe. Now, those were incredible. And as I've explained to Joe, Bob Perry very seldom called McGovern to compare notes with anything. I mean, McGovern called Bob Perry often. But, so he knew his way around. And but this time he called me. He said, "Ray, did you read the transcripts of Strzok and Page?" And I say, "I did." He said, "My God, Ray, do you think blah, blah, blah?" And we compared notes. We thought about the same. I said, "Yeah, Bob, I tried. I was going to say, Bobby, you want me to write it up tonight?" But I knew he wanted to do it. Now, that was his last substantive piece. And he coined the phrase FBI Gate. And that's exactly what it was. FBI Gate with a lot of help from the CIA, NSA, and the Department of Justice. But he had it nailed, okay? Now, that was December 13th. On December 12th, VIPS put up a memo, which Bob published, which very carefully defined the difference between a leak and a hack, and showed with 7 slides, most of them procured from Edward Snowden, exactly how a hack would have worked, exactly where the trace routes in these lines were, where NSA would have had a hack. And Bill Binney gave all the information, of course. I acted as a scribe, and we put it all together. But we were on record, December 12th, 2016 with that piece, and Bob, of course, put it up. Now, what I'll also say here is that this was not Bob's first piece in December on the same subject.
Right.
Guess what? It was his fourth.
Mm-hmm.
It was fourth. So this is December 13th. It was number 4, okay? Then he had the stroke. And, when I saw him in the hospital, he was kind of doped up and all. He looked over, he said, Ray, it's too much, right? It's just too much, too much. Well, Bob slaved away 7 days a week, and it was too much. And that's what happened. And we're dearly hoping it doesn't happen to Joe. But Bob worked so hard, and he got it right, and he had the presence of mind to do what we do in the intelligence community, some of the good things we do. And that is when there's an expert that is far head and shoulders above other experts in a technical way, like Bill Binney was. After all, he kind of constructed these systems. Mm-hmm. Then you believe him. You trust them. You say, well, you know more than anybody else, and you're being heckled by people who don't know anything about these systems, so we trust you. And that's what Bob awarded us. He saw that we were such fastidious analysts that even though we didn't know journalism very well, we were honest and we told it like it was. And he trusted us. And that's why we're proud, as well as Bob is, to have the record that VIPS has done, and now to be kind of, affirmed. Many people who will be listening to this will probably not know that a year later, that is a year after Bill Binney and I did that memo for VIPS, there was a interview, there was a testimony by the head of CrowdStrike, the cyber firm that the DNC hired to look at the so-called hack into the DNC system. His name was Sean Henry.
Yes.
He's appearing for the House Intelligence Committee. And what does he say? Adam Schiff, can you tell us, Mr. Henry, exactly when the Russians hacked DNC emails? Mr. Henry, talking to his lawyer. Actually, we don't have any evidence of that. There is no evidence that any information was exfiltrated on the net. And so sometimes we get that evidence, but this time we're getting it. Now, okay, that's December 5th, 2017. That was kept secret until May 7th, 2020, when the Director of National Intelligence forced Adam Schiff to release it.
Yep.
So May 7th, 2020. That's over half a year ago. Mm-hmm. Have you read it in the New York Times? No. Have you read it in any major media? Has Amy Goodman covered it? No. What does it say? It says that the whole thing there was no technical evidence, which is what Sean Henry said, that anything was exfiltrated, a fancy word for hacked. So, we feel pretty good about this, but also frustrated that most Americans are deprived of this knowledge because of the state of the major media.
And the New York Times did publish at least partial mea culpa for its error-riddled reporting that led to the invasion of Iraq, the whole mobile weapons labs, the Judy Miller, is that her name?
Yep.
Yeah, Judith Miller. And yet there has not even been an honest correction of the record related to the fundamental claim of the Russiagate narrative, the centerpiece of the limited hangout Mueller investigation and subsequent report. And there's been no effort to correct what is a dangerously wrong narrative that is believed by virtually all Democrats and many other Americans because it's just been drilled into them so frequently for so long. And Joe Lauria, you have occasionally published work by Aaron Maté, and his recent interview with Rick Gates, who was the partner of Paul Manafort in the campaign work that they did in Ukraine, affirms many of these errors and omissions, and in particular the omissions. For example, and in particular, that Konstantin Kilimnik, who, according to the bipartisan Senate report and to the suggestions in the Mueller report, was allegedly a Russian asset, he was in fact an American asset who was very active in Ukraine, not in Russia. And so, Joe, that's just one example of the many omissions from the official record.
Yes, many, many omissions and many false statements. Before I begin to answer you, I just want to correct something Ray said, which was it was December 2017 that Bob wrote those 4 pieces, not 2016. And, I want to go back to what I said at the beginning about Bob's principles of nonpartisanship allowed him to be the first. And Aaron Mate is credited Bob as being the first on our own webcast, CN Live, of being the first to be skeptical and to start to debunk Russiagate. And that was because Bob was just doing his reporting, not from any political point of view, from any partisan point of view, just looking at the facts. Mm-hmm. And of course, fortunately, yes, we see no apology from the New York Times, a retraction similar to the one they made after the invasion of Iraq, which has been forgotten. And I'm glad you brought it up, Peter. And why is that? Because if you looked at Jen Psaki, the incoming White House press secretary, the other day, she tweeted that for anyone who hasn't been the target of Russian propaganda, the purpose is to discredit powerful messengers and to spread misinformation to confuse the public. Anyone who repeats it is unwitting or not simply a puppet of the propaganda machine. They have not let go of this. This is going to be a feature of the Biden administration. They're going to wheel this out whenever there's legitimate criticism of the Biden administration. They will smear it as Russian propaganda. This completely takes away any power of indigenous, legitimate criticism from Americans of an American government by smearing it as being part of some foreign interference or foreign sabotage of elections, of the administration coming. And I think that's really chilling. Now, these people are sore losers. The Russiagators, there's one thing that Russiagators have in common with Donald Trump. They're both sore losers. Continue to believe in this. I cannot believe that they do not see that this Russiagate story has been debunked by 2 people. Robert Mueller in his report, who said there was no conspiracy, i.e. collusion, yep, and John Henry, as Ray was just talking about, that there was no exfiltration, i.e. hacking. But the Senate report they keep referring to, that you refer to, still says that there was Russian interference in this election, still said that there was some dealings with the Trump campaign. Well, the reason I think is because Mueller and Henry were under legal obligation to tell the truth. Mueller as being a prosecutor and Henry having been under oath in that testimony to the House Intelligence Committee. Intelligence agencies have no obligation to tell the truth. So they're still following this intelligence story about Russia. They are still actually idiots, useful idiots of American intelligence. We're called useful idiots of Russian intelligence. But these people are actually the ones who still believe in Russiagate. And now Jen Psaki is still spreading this. Very, very chilling. The intelligence agencies is what I think that Senate report was based on. And they totally seem to have ignored that Mueller said there was no conspiracy and Henry said there was no hack. Those are the 2 core elements of Russiagate. Without a hack and without conspiracy, there is no Russiagate. So Aaron Mate, I didn't see his interview. I will, but he's done a great job on this. And there's so many holes in the Russiagate story. And we need to continue, unfortunately, to cover this because, as I've said, they seem to be they're keeping this in their back pocket, as Psaki has alerted all of us to with her tweet. It's going to be a rough ride coming up. That's Indeed. What I think.
Yeah. And Ray, you, in your years at the CIA, were a Russia specialist. You also briefed Reagan, the daily briefing, during part of his administration. And one of the fundamental misdirects on the low information American media consumer is fundamental about the posture of Ukraine and Manafort's advice to Yanukovych, who was the victim of a U.S.-backed coup. Yes, he was deeply corrupt, and there are many issues that show that Yanukovych was no saint. but Manafort was advising him consistent with American foreign policy, and that is he was trying to focus Ukraine toward Europe and NATO and away from Moscow. And that has been corrupted to make it appear that Ukraine and Russia are virtually interchangeable as American opponents. I won't call them enemies. And you know, the media has really done little to try to correct that fundamental misinformation that is held by so many Americans.
Well, that's for sure. That's the sad part of all this. I go back up to New York, where I went to university and have all these friends, and they read the New York Times every day, cover to cover, and they think they're informed. My God. Well, one thing they don't know is that the head of CrowdStrike has disavowed any knowledge that there were technical evidence of a Russian hack. So it's very distressing. And Manafort, well, that gets real into the weeds, and people can't understand that sort of thing. What I like to pick up on is you said, you quoted the New York Times very tepid apology, so to speak, for Judy Miller and David Sanger and all those people. They Russia, not Russia, Iraq, right. WMD. On a lighter note, Bob Perry was told that the Columbia Journalism Review had an interview with Fred Hyatt. Now, Fred Hyatt has been head of the editorial page, or the op-ed page at least, of the Washington Post for 20 years. Mm-hmm. 20 years, okay? And they said, now, you kept saying there were weapons of mass destruction there. Well, what do you think now? And Hyatt said, and this is a quote, well, if there weren't any weapons of mass destruction there, then we probably shouldn't have said that there were, end quote. Bob commented, yeah, that's sort of a basic principle of journalism. If something isn't true, you're not supposed to say that it is. Again. But Hyatt still sits there, just one little tack on to you. After David Kay, who was recipient of and spent up to $1 billion with a B dollars looking for WMD in Iraq, after he finally admitted in the spring of 2005, there ain't none. We were wrong. I apologize. I was in Detroit. I had an interview with the Detroit Free Press, and the executive board wanted to hear what I thought. And I told them exactly what I've been telling you, Peter B., and everybody else, and they were amazed. And what did they do? They published a major editorial, and they said, we were wrong, and we really are sorry for misleading our readers. We suggest respectfully that other newspapers also apologize for misleading their readers on such an important issue. Now, that's the only, guess what, nobody took up that suggestion, but they were flabbergasted. They couldn't believe what I was telling them until they believed it. Mm-hmm. And that's how bad it was back then.
And so we have no acknowledgement of this, very serious body of bad information that is widely believed. And this creates this dichotomy where Donald Trump, who I loathe, and I don't support him except in his inclination to withdraw U.S. troops from Syria and a few other places, still, I have to acknowledge that he has been the victim of fake news, that there has been an effort to discredit him and those around him by using ginned-up information that came from anonymous leaks, mostly, I believe, from John Brennan and Jimmy Clapper, who ping-ponged back and forth to the Times, and then the Times would ping-pong with the Washington Post, and they would create the illusion that the intelligence community had this solid information that showed the links between Trump and Russia and the allegations that Russia helped him win the election in 2016. And it is so far from the truth that, we have a divided nation. Fox doesn't help that, but we have to be honest that the mainstream corporate media, including CNN, MSNBC, and the major national papers, have not attempted to correct the record in any way, and they consider it an investment that they have to ride out until Trump is gone at minimum, because they can't lose face by acknowledging that they fucked up. Joe, your comment?
Of course they won't. They have become, look at the way CNN covered the election, crying on air, jubilation. I mean, and go back to the very first broadcast of CNN in 1980. They had an interview with President Carter. They had a report from the Middle East. They had an investigative report on airline fuel gauges being wrong. I mean, that was journalism on television. And then look at CNN today. And they're not the only ones, obviously. There's going to be no effort to stop this, as I was saying, to stop the Russiagate story, because it is useful to them. And for them not to admit they were wrong and to continue to use this and keep this going is beyond chilling. It is unbelievable malfeasance in journalism. You have to admit when you're wrong and correct the record. They have lost all credibility because first with Iraq in 2003 and now Russiagate. It's gotten worse. Russiagate was even worse because we did have these apologies. We did have these corrections, as Ray was just saying, in the Free Press and the New York Times apology on the front page. And we're going to see nothing like that with Russiagate, unfortunately. We're going to see a continuation of using smearing critics with being tools of a foreign intelligence service when they themselves are the tools of U.S. intelligence services. It's another thing Bob Perry did, he dug out from the archives of the Reagan Library, I believe, this entire story of how the CIA was working from within the White House on a perception management campaign led by William Casey, who was CIA director, who did say in the room, and Ray could confirm this even better than I can, Barbara Honegger, I think her name was present, and she had said it on the record, and to me and to Ray and to many people, that Casey said essentially that when the American people believe all the lies we're telling them, I'm not quoting it directly, we know we've done our job. And they have succeeded at that. And we've not seen that in better examples of that than in the 2003 Iraq invasion based on absolute falsified intelligence and Russiagate. Again, falsified intelligence. As long as the corporate media allows themselves to be tools of the intelligence agencies and don't stand up to them. Don't forget, after the defeat in Vietnam and after Watergate, when you began your radio career, Peter, and after the Church Committee and the other Senate and House committee investigations, there was a huge skepticism in the U.S. press about intelligence agencies. They weren't to be believed. That lasted maybe 7 years until Ronald Reagan came in with his Morning Again in America when it was barely night. And the myths of America being the great shining city on the hill, spreading democracy rather than death, destruction in the interests of economic and geostrategic power, it stopped. So there was a brief period when the press was actually skeptical and critical of the intelligence agencies because the Senate did its job in the oversight, and the central government of the United States was on a back foot, and the militarists were on their back foot because they'd lost a major war that they had squandered so many lives and treasure in Vietnam. And even though they have now lost in Iraq, basically they're losing and lost in Afghanistan, we're not seeing the same oversight from the intelligence committees or any kind of skepticism from the press. So it's gotten a lot worse now, and I don't expect it to get better under Biden because they're going to continue to use this false smear of being a tool of foreign intelligence agencies when, in fact, it's the U.S. media that are tools of U.S. intelligence.
Well, and as we see Biden populating his cabinet, which is variously Obama third term or Clinton fifth term, these are the same people who supported the blunders that led to the devastating setbacks that we've suffered because of the invasion of Iraq. And more recently, during the Obama years, they were the ones who countenanced the covert operations in Syria, the leading from behind to take down Gaddafi in Libya. And even Obama has admitted that the Libya misadventure was his biggest misjudgment as president. I have a few other nominations, but that's his point of view. Ray, your comments?
Yeah. Well, yeah, there are a lot of candidates there. I'd like to bring us back to the kernel issue here. What I call the Mickey Mat, okay, it rhymes with Mickey Mouse. It's the military, industrial, congressional, intelligence, media, academia, think tank complex. Okay. Mickey Mouse. Remember it.
All right.
Now, what am I saying that for? What am I saying media for? Because media is the cornerstone. It won't work without the media. Now, who owns the media? The rest of the Mickey Mat. Who owns Congress? The rest of the Mickey Mat. So media plays an incredibly important role here. I mean, that's saying the obvious, but if media cares more about selling weapons or selling fighters or jets to places like Saudi Arabia than they do about the truth, well, you need a Russia. You need a Russia that is painted as very dangerous and very, so it all melds very nicely. And I'll just say this, too. You talked about the people who are being picked to be the new people in the new administration. Well, the prime candidate for CIA is a fellow named Mikey Morell. Mm-hmm. Now, who's Mikey Morell? Oh, Mikey Morell is the guy that George Tenet, slam dunk Tenet, Tenet picked to brief George W. Bush with the President's Daily Brief, which I used to brief, for the whole first year. So that's 2001. What happened in 2001? Well, 2001, we know what happened then. And then 2002, there was the whole business about ginning up spurious intelligence on weapons of mass destruction. So Morell was there at the creation. And, of course, Tenet sings his praise. Going a little closer to these times, Morell was on Charlie Rose every other month. Charlie loved them. You could see it. They loved each other. Once Charlie said, "Oh, maybe I asked you the wrong question." And Mike said, "Oh, no, Charlie, you always ask the right questions, okay?" Well, what was the question? What we do in Syria? Mike Morell. "Oh, we kill a couple of Iranians, we kill a couple of Syrians, and we kill a couple of Russians." I beg your pardon? "Yeah, we kill a couple of Russians. Make them understand that. Okay. Well, he gets a mulligan. He gets 2 weeks later, Charlie has him back and "Could you explain what you said about telling them about?" Well, the way he explained it didn't help much at all. But that's Mikey Morell. Mikey Morell doesn't know diddly about Russia. And the last thing I'll say on this is when people say, "McGovern, why are you so caught up on this business about the Russian hack?" I say it's very simple. Russia has nuclear weapons. Did you forget about that? I mean, Russia has nuclear weapons. Can you understand that? And oh, they do? Or what does that matter? Well, these people are responsible, and you can push the Russians just so far.
One other thing I want to mention about Russiagate that I think is another media failure is they make no distinction, and particularly today, Hillary's emails are just all one big pallet load, right? But it's important to note that the original State Department emails were released under pressure from reporter Jason Leopold, a longtime friend of mine, who was at Vice News at the time, and they sued to force the release of the emails that had been on her personal server as a way of avoiding the Freedom of Information Act. Then there were the issues about the emails that were not released having been culled out by top staff members of the former Secretary of State. Then there were the emails that came from the DNC servers, and that's where the allegation of Russian hacking came in. And just to keep all this straight, the final tranche of emails were from the interception of John Podesta's cell phone. And so in retrospect now, the public believes, they can't make a distinction between the different sources of these emails. They only know that they weren't supposed to find any of them credible because of Russia, Russia, Russia. And there were serious, potentially criminal acts that were exposed in the body of the emails from these different batches. And in particular, I recall the effort by the Crown Prince of Bahrain to secure an appointment with Secretary Clinton. She was very, very busy. So he went over to the Clinton Foundation, dropped $1 million in the coffers, and suddenly Hillary was available within days. And not only did she take the meeting with him, but after that meeting, there was a significant shift in U.S. policy toward Bahrain relative to the protests that developed as part of the so-called Arab Spring. That's just one example. And isn't it true that Jen Psaki has been running the Clinton Foundation as she waited for a Democrat to return to the White House, Joe?
You mean in the last few years?
Yes.
No, I didn't. I wasn't aware of that, but that's great news.
I believe that has been reported. Yes.
Well, there you go. What else does there need to be said about that? And again, Hillary got away with that, and many other things that were in those accurate emails that WikiLeaks published. And just yesterday, speaking of Aaron Mate, he put out on Twitter some new documents that have come to light, in which this McCabe, the deputy director of the FBI, said that, quoting from a Washington Post article, that U.S. intelligence officials said the CIA has identified who took possession of those stolen files, DNC, and delivered them to WikiLeaks. And it says the individual known for their affiliations to Russian intelligence, but they're one step removed from the Russian government. But to say that someone took possession and delivered does not sound like a hack. So there's even more evidence coming out about that. And the point I make, and Ray and I seem to have sometimes a disagreement on that, although I do think it's important to point out this was not a hack, and I've been doing that on this very program. I from a journalistic point of view, I focus on the fact that the documents were accurate. They were real. Debbie Wasserman Schultz and 3 or 4 other DNC officials, high-ranking, had to resign when WikiLeaks published that just before the Democratic Convention in 2016. Why? Because there was evidence of corruption in there, like the one you just mentioned. And therefore, it's important to focus on the facts of the documents. If the documents are correct, it doesn't matter who the source is. That's the reason why WikiLeaks started an anonymous Dropbox, and why you have the Wall Street Journal, the Guardian, the Times, CNN. 70 major media around the world have now created anonymous Dropboxes. You could have Russia put something in CNN's box, and if it's accurate documents and if it's newsworthy, CNN will publish it, and they'll never know that it was Russia who was the source. It doesn't matter who the source is. And so it's irrelevant whether this was a hack or a leak from the journalistic point of view, because the documents were correct. And that's all we should be focusing on. But to smear the source, who the Democrats still say was Russia, and there's no evidence for that, is to try to deflect from the contents of the emails. That's what this was about, at least one part of it. Also to create tension with Russia, there's no doubt about it. There was a geostrategic element to Russiagate as well. But it's important to remember that these information is accurate, and when it's accurate, it doesn't matter who the source is. When you're talking about documents, to what the motive is irrelevant of the source.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. And I just want to note for listeners that after the Mueller report was released, I did a podcast with Bill Binney, and we went through Section 1 of the report, paragraph by paragraph, and identified the way it was written and how it suggested certain things without really proving anything. And in particular, the reference to the indictments of about a dozen Russians, indictments are not evidence. Yet many people believe that because they were richly embellished with details about the middle names of these Russian GRU agents and the address where they worked in Moscow and the serial number on their building passes, that this is all supposed to be highly credible. But, those indictments were flushed by Attorney General Barr, I believe, or maybe it was Sessions. And we know that there was a lot of sleight of hand in the Mueller report that the media played up as if it were a solid fact-based evidence. And this has, I think, created another enduring issue where the credibility of the media has been left in tatters, and the truth is the real victim lying deeply wounded on the operating table. Ray?
Well, I think you're exactly right here. If you take Mueller, he's right doing this investigation, right? Julian Assange makes it known, I'd be happy to be interviewed. I kind of know something about this, about the emails at least. Come interview me. Craig Murray, former ambassador in London, British ambassador to Uzbekistan, former. He says, I was involved too. I happen to know somebody that I am convinced was a source. Please come interview me. Murray says, I never got any answer from my request to be interviewed. And of course, Julian didn't either. So how are you going to do an investigation like this without interviewing these two key sources? I don't know how you get away with that. But of course, he did. The 12 Russians and all that business, it's really ridiculous how something that ostensibly looks good, or the so-called the Facebook posts by that internet search agency. Well, long story short, for the period of time that they existed, and this went into months after the election, they amounted to, if you got a pencil, 0.00000024% of the material available to people on the internet, on Facebook. So, these things don't bear close scrutiny, and I guess.
And Ray, in addition, a documentary that was recently released showed how in a small town in Macedonia called Velis, there was a group of people who they went to a class to learn how to generate clickbait on the internet. And they generated so much fake news content about the U.S. election of 2016 that in aggregate, these people generated $60 million in payments for the ads that ran on the fake news pages that they generated. They hired Americans to write the fake news articles. And this had much more impact than anything that came out of St. Petersburg. And even Scott Shane of the New York Times tracked down the kid in Baltimore who wrote the fake post that the Pope had endorsed Donald Trump. So, they just simply don't let facts get in the way of this kind of prefab narrative that Russia was responsible. So I want to, you've both made references to WikiLeaks. And Joe Lauria, I want to thank Consortium News and Craig Murray and Kevin Gostola of Shadowproof for the excellent coverage of the Assange extradition hearing that occurred in September and October of this year. And I have done frequent searches at the New York Times. I believe as of today they have only written 4 stories about that whole process, and 2 of them were scene setters. The third was about the technical issues that they were having problems with in the courtroom. And there was a kind of wrap-up piece that was published after the hearings were over. But there was substantial information, not just about how Julian Assange is exempted from the extradition treaty and Britain's separate extradition law because this is a political case. In addition, we learned about the Spanish intelligence firm that was hired to run the cameras and other surveillance gear at the Ecuador embassy in London, where Assange had been granted asylum. And we learned that Sheldon Adelson, the largest single donor to the Trump campaign, an outsized supporter of Israel who runs a casino operation in Las Vegas, his security arm engaged the Spanish company, and it is believed that they were delivering live real-time streams from the Assange suite at the embassy to American intelligence operations. This is a stunning revelation, and I don't believe it's been covered in any major media outlet here in the United States.
Well, it hasn't been. Before I answer that, though, I just wanted to add something to the last question, if I can, Peter, that it was a dereliction of duty of journalism to take an indictment as being fact. I think Mueller knew that his theory in his indictment of those 12 GRU agents would never be tested in court because those 12 guys would never be extradited to the U.S. When he tried to go after the IRA, the Internet Research Agency, they had a lawyer in Washington asking for a discovery. Ultimately, he had to drop that case. So Mueller could have made a political indictment, really, because he knew when he went after Manafort, for example, he knew that when he went after American citizens, he would have to come up with some evidence because they would be in court. Now, to get to your question about WikiLeaks, yes, we had direct access every day, live streaming from the courtroom. We were one of a few, about 30 media outlets only, that requested that. And there were only a few other reporters in an adjoining room at Old Bailey in London to cover it. This is, as your listeners know, the most extraordinarily important case about media freedom and about the U.S. First Amendment butting up against the Espionage Act. And it's a very chilling thing if he's extradited, because it means that any journalist who writes something that is, again, exposes corruption or criminality by the U.S. government anywhere in the world can be charged now with espionage, which is unbelievable to even contemplate. Now, as far as you mentioned the UC Global thing, I immediately put that story out. We had live tweeting, we had live updates every day, and I did a video report every night. And I immediately connected that to Dan Ellsberg, because when Dan Ellsberg's case was ultimately dropped, it was because the government Nixon had sent the plumbers into his psychiatrist's office to try to dig up dirt on him. They also tapped his telephones. And they also tried to bribe the judge in that case with the FBI directorship. This was, in Ellsberg's reacted very strongly when I reported that and thanked me directly, because he said this was even worse. What they did to Julian in the embassy was even worse than what had happened to him. What did they do? The main things, the most dramatic things are they discussed, I'm talking about the intelligence agencies, discussed kidnapping or poisoning Julian Assange. And they had 24/7 surveillance there through this Spanish company. And a most important thing they were after were his privileged discussions with his lawyers, discussing the very case he's now being tried for on an extradition hearing in London. So, I mean, in any normal cases, as it was ultimately in Ellsberg's case, this kind of prosecutorial malfeasance would be leading to the case being thrown out. We have the intelligence arm of the prosecuting government eavesdropping on the private defense preparations of the defendant. I mean, this is extraordinary that it wasn't A, reported on, and B, that Vanessa Barreza, the judge in London, doesn't understand that this case cannot go forward. At least her judgment will come January 4th. We don't know what she's going to say, but this is a very strong argument why this case should be thrown out. And those of us who understand the consequences of this case and why it's so wrong hope that she understands that, let alone the political nature of the prosecution, which does violate the UK-US extradition treaty, and the health issues of Assange and the prison conditions that he'd be sent into, that he was suicidal. This came out clearly in court, and he's on the autism spectrum. There are numerous reasons why he should not be extradited, but one of the main ones is the UC Global, as you mentioned, Peter, the Spanish firm that was contracted by a U.S. intelligence agency, most likely the CIA, to spy on Assange at the embassy.
Ray, what would you like to add from your perspective as a former CIA officer?
Well, I worked in analysis, not in operations, but, there were operations people that had these covert techniques like entrapment. What happened to Julian Assange in Sweden is a classic case of suborning Swedish police officers into ginning up a non-existent case, and that led to the whole imprisonment that led to the whole getting of Julian. What I would add is that Joe is, my hat's off to Joe for covering this in such detail and with such perspicacity. What I'd also say is that it couldn't be much more important. This is the case that matters the most for the free press. And without a free press, you know what we get. In addition to all this, Julian is a friend of mine. I visited with him in that embassy a few times. It hurts. It hurts me, and it hurts to think about his partner Stella, little Gabriel, and little Max. This is a human problem. They're killing this guy slowly. They're hoping he'll get COVID, and then there'll be no problem with them having to try him anywhere else. Everyone will get the lesson. That's the point of all this. Look what happens to people who cross the deep state. This is what's going to happen to you. If you publish anything, we're going to get you. If you're in Antarctica, if you're in Greenland, we're going to get you, and we're going to try you and put you in a max security prison. So it's the most important thing that's happened in this area over the last several years. The abominable, the terrible cowardice of the mainstream media speaks volumes. I guess they figure it can't happen to them as long as they toe the line, and they're probably true up to a point, but it's going to happen to them eventually as well. It's already happening to the likes of us.
And Joe, there's no wiggle room here. WikiLeaks was and is a publisher. The New York Times, the Washington Post, and Consortium News, you are publishers. And the rights that are taken away from WikiLeaks will also be subject to withdrawal from other media outlets. And the failure to identify the self-interest and the hypocrisy of these mainstream media organizations that used the materials from WikiLeaks, profited from them, in some cases won journalism awards for publishing them, they have now turned their backs, not only on Assange, but on the case itself. And this is really the lowest of the low of the media malpractice that we've been witnessing, in my opinion.
No question about it. Assange won awards for those very documents that he published that he's now being prosecuted for. You know, the prosecutor, James Lewis, QC, the British lawyer for the U.S. in the extradition hearing, on the very first day of this hearing, which took place back in February in London, and I was there in London at the time covering it, he said he turned to the press box in the courtroom, this is before COVID, of course, and he said, "This is not about you. We're not going after the press. This guy harmed informants," okay? Of course, the last 4 weeks of this thing in September showed that he was not going after informants, that he actually was the one who was interested in redacting those names and not the Guardian and the other partners. And also other people had, like Der Spiegel and Krypton, had published this document, this unredacted document with some of the names in there before WikiLeaks had. And in fact, it was released because the two Guardian journalists, Luke Harding and David Lee, in a book, published the password. Yeah. And that's how people were able to get it. So, but what happened later in the hearing is that Lewis then admitted, they changed tack, that yes, Assange is a journalist, but we can go after journalists because of this technical part that's still in the Espionage Act, that Tulsi Gabbard and Ro Connor and others have written a bill to try to carve out an exception for journalists. But right now, as the Espionage Act stands, any person, journalist or anyone, who has unauthorized possession and then who makes unauthorized dissemination can be charged. And that's what the government, it's the only case they have against him on this technicality, which clearly seems to be unconstitutional and needs to be challenged. And maybe Assange's lawyers will if it gets to the U.S. as a violation of the First Amendment. So they admit now he's a journalist, but he violated this part of the Constitution. He had possession. It's not just about the informants, which got debunked in the 4 weeks of that hearing. So they're going after him on this narrow technicality of the Espionage Act. And this is, again, chilling because, as Ray says, someday they probably will go after. We can get some president who hates the press even more than Trump down the line. And now this precedent will be set if he's extradited and convicted, that anybody in the media, unless those bills that I mentioned by Tulsi Gabbard and others get passed, and doesn't look very good right now, this remains a part of the Espionage Act that can be used against any journalist. And it was never used against any journalist before until Assange. Even Nixon impaneled a grand jury in Boston to go after the two Times reporters who published the Pentagon Papers. But after what happened in Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office and the other things that the prosecutors did, they dropped that because the two journalists asked the government, if you've been tapping Ellsberg's phone, that means you were tapping us because we were on the phone with him. After that, Nixon dropped that, disbanded that grand jury, just the way Obama tried to also indict Assange, the Obama administration, but they realized they would also have to go after the New York Times because they published the exact same material that Assange did. Based on that understanding, they did not pursue a prosecution of Assange, but the Trump administration did. And one of the worst things Trump did, obviously, amongst many other things, was to do that.
I just want to interject here that I have the deepest respect for Chelsea Manning and the courage that she showed in her second round of incarceration. As people know, she was convicted in the court-martial, 35 years. Obama commuted the sentence, and then she was reincarcerated for alleged contempt when she refused to testify against Assange in the WikiLeaks grand jury proceedings here in the United States. And so it was even more absurd when they attempted to skirt, as you pointed out, Joe, the journalism principles under the Espionage Act and claim that Assange had helped her access computers that she already had access to. And it shows the bankrupt nature of the case that they presented, and that while there are many criticisms of Obama, he and his team did recognize that they didn't want to pursue a prosecution of Assange because of the First Amendment and press freedom issues. And so it was the two clever people under Trump who said, well, we can just avoid that and try to nail him for non-journalism issues. And that, I believe, fell apart in the proceedings in London. Would you agree, Joe?
Yes, of course it did. Again, they focus almost entirely on the beginning on this informants issue. And it doesn't seem to be a statute that criminalizes revealing names of informants. Of course, you can't reveal the name of covert agents, as we saw in the Valerie Plame case, for example. But that was what their focus was, that and there's no harm that was ever proven to come to any of these informants. In fact, a general, his name is escaping me now, in the Chelsea Manning court-martial, admitted that there was no evidence of any harm that came from the release of these documents that she'd given to WikiLeaks. So it was a hollow case. So they now had to shift towards, yes, he's a journalist, but we can still get him on this Espionage Act case.
Ray, do you want to add anything here?
I'd like to jump in here. I'm really glad, Joe, that you made the point that there was no harm. If we take a step back and we realize that American audiences are very malnourished on the facts of this case, we have to recognize that two things stand out. One is that most Americans consider Julian Assange a rapist. That is the work of intelligence agencies leaning on the Swedes to make that allegation. Okay, it ain't true. Niels Melzer, the UN rapporteur for torture, who speaks fluent Swedish, by the way, went there, looked through their documents and found them to be forged. Okay, so he's not a rapist. Okay, now number two, the harm. This is really important. Most Americans feel that, oh my God, as soon as the Iraq war logs and the Afghan reports and the diplomatic, oh my God, the harm was immense, and everybody complained. Well, Carl Levin, who used to head up the Senate Senate Armed Services Committee, asked the Secretary of Defense, his name was Robert Gates at the time. He said, give me a memo on that, all right? And Gates came back and he said, well, these charges that there was harm coming out of these reports, the acknowledgement of what went on, are, quote, significantly overwrought, period, end quote. The head of the forces, our forces, U.S. forces in Afghanistan, the head of the U.S. forces in that whole area, and the Secretary of Defense are saying no damage came from these. Now that's not the press. That's not the impression that the press gave. So on both of these counts, Americans need to know that they're being deprived of knowing about a case that will have incredible repercussions, as Joe has already mentioned, on the ability of a free press to operate, not only in this country, but elsewhere, where the tentacles of the U.S. government can reach and just snap up any reporter and put them in Belmarsh prison.
So, gentlemen, as we move toward wrapping up here, I just want to raise one more issue related to Russiagate, and that is that John Durham is a U.S. attorney in Connecticut who was assigned by Attorney General Barr to investigate the investigation that the FBI launched, they say, in the summer of 2016, but it may have actually been earlier than that. And Ray, you and I talked about this a while back, and I certainly believe that there is a there. I don't have confidence in John Durham. I believe he is a politicized operator. And Mr. Barr revealed that 2 weeks before the election, he designated him a special counsel as an apparent way to give him more shelf life with an incoming Democratic administration. What do you see coming out of this? Because I think the three of us agree that there are important threads that need to be exposed. Again, my issue is that they will come in a political package.
Well, the way I see it, Peter B., is that Durham did a good job on real crime, like up in Boston with Whitey Bulger. He put a couple of supervisory FBI agents in jail for many years. So he's got a good record on that kind of criminality. When he's hired by the likes of Attorney General Mukasey or Attorney General Eric Holder to do a job on political crimes, Mukasey is just, Durham is just a functionary. He'll do what he's told. He let people off for torture. He let people off for destroying videos of torture. Mm-hmm. And he did that because the Attorney General told him to do that. Now, getting to the present, is this an artful move, like the New York Times says? Oh, man, how clever Barr, the Attorney General, is in making this guy a special counsel, okay? That's balderdash. Durham will have exactly zero ability to act independently after January 20th. A good friend of mine, a lawyer, former prosecutor, Elizabeth de la Vega, has said, look, Barr hasn't pulled any brilliant move. The Attorney General doesn't have to remove Durham after the 20th of January. Durham will need approval from the Attorney General for anything. Go to the bathroom. She didn't say go to the bathroom. She said the Attorney General will decide the propriety of proposed acts by applying the law to the facts. So in my view, and I think people will disagree with this, Durham has been neutered rather than given a special status, and Barr, to make it very simple, has jumped ship. He's joined the other rats leaving the ship, and if further evidence of that were needed, he directly contradicted the president earlier this week in saying there was no fraud discovered by the Department of Justice relating to the intelligence.
All right. Well, gentlemen, I want to thank you for a great conversation today. And I also want to thank you for years of contribution by each of you to my podcast and my personal knowledge of these issues, both on the podcast and just in my reading of the work published at Consortium News, like everybody else. You really set standards for investigating and truth-telling, and you have my deepest respect and my enduring gratitude.
Well, Peter, I wanted to congratulate you on your retirement, and I suppose most of it will be spent on a boat in the bay.
As much as possible, and if we could get some snow, I'd be up in the mountains right now.
Well, Peter, I also want to thank you for for all your work over the years, and I hope that you'll write a book about all this, because it'd be really nice to have a book written by somebody who knows what's going on.
Well, I actually might do that, Ray. I'm thinking about it. It's a daunting task, but I may have the time to address that. So thank you for suggesting it. Ray McGovern, Joe Lauria, thanks for joining me for a last interview here at peterbcollins.com.
You're most welcome.
Thanks for listening to this last interview with Joe Lauria and Ray McGovern. Send your comments to Peter at peterbcollins.com.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.